community of practice. One of the big challenges here is that there's a lot of different agencies and community groups and other folks who are working on heat, but that there is no kind of central gathering point for that work. And no one entity here kind of owns the issue of heat, even though this is something that impacts our community regularly every summer. So one of the things that I'm currently kind of wrestling with is how formal or informal to structure this community of practice. And also some of the challenges around building a nascent community of practice, getting people to come to the table, share knowledge, decide on what actions are going to be best, and to do all of that while properly sort of engaging community and listening to the folks here who are most exposed to heat, and hearing what their challenges are and hearing what their needs are and what types of resources they desire to better create heat adapted communities. I think I mentioned at the beginning of this call, I was talking to Jacqueline, that before I started with the Desert Research Institute, I was working with Clark County here in Southern Nevada as their Urban Heat Fellow. And there is a body of existing knowledge about heat. And we have access to reports and information that help us identify where the urban heat island is most impacting communities and what types of community characteristics make residents of these neighborhoods and these parts of our urban area more vulnerable to heat, which could be things like socioeconomic conditions, health conditions, age, that sort of thing. So we have some of that information. But one of the big gaps that I identified coming into this role is that we haven't asked a lot of human questions. So we haven't necessarily gone to communities and asked, what are you already doing to cope with heat when it happens? What is the cultural understanding of heat here in Southern Nevada? I know that as I started my work down here on climate adaptation and heat resilience, there was kind of an existing attitude, particularly from decision makers and policymakers, that it's just hot here, like, duh, it's Las Vegas. What do you expect? And so that heat wasn't necessarily seen as anything other than, this sort of pre-existing condition in our communities, and it was kind of ignored in that way. And so we have challenges in not just discussing heat with those folks who are the decision makers, but also talking to communities about heat. What is their understanding of heat? How do they think about the health impacts? What are they doing in their day-to-day? What are the things that challenge our residents the most when it gets really, really hot out? And most importantly, what do these frontline communities need? So there are, a lot of different plans and proposed actions, but from my perspective, it's all been kind of a top-down discussion. And so one of my goals is to kind of open up new lines of communication and to build trust with our frontline communities so that they feel comfortable coming to us and articulating what they have identified as needs for their communities. So to do that, we have to develop a tool and some methodology for community engagement. And I've been thinking a lot about all the different kinds of populations and all the different folks that we need to make space for and converse with and listen to. And I think one of our challenges is that that's going to have to look different from population to population. So to get a good idea of what our unhoused folks are doing to cope with heat during our heat season, we may need to engage with them in a very different manner from, if we go into a neighborhood with a lot of senior citizens. All of these different populations need to and want to communicate in different ways, which means that something like a survey tool might work well for one population, but may not be the right fit for another population. So we need to think about how to tackle this engagement so that it is a right fit for all these different populations, and so that it's effective, so that the folks who are engaging with us, that we are engaging with, feel that their voices are being heard and they're given a platform to start elevating the needs that they identify. And the goal is to come up with a couple different ways of doing this that are translatable to tribal and rural populations in years 2 and 3 of this project. So for this first year, we are focusing on the metro area simply because that's where I'm located. And that's where kind of the bulk of existing knowledge and understanding already exists. One of the ways I think I'm hoping to move forward is by using a rapid cycle think tank. So I've got one scheduled for early June, and I'm bringing together a small group of practitioners from here in Las Vegas to sit down and discuss what are where are you guys seeing gaps in implementation and knowledge and data and all sorts of different, all the different sorts of knowledge we need to move forward with this project. And then from there, identify some additional questions, prioritize needs, and hopefully find a space for the Southern Nevada Heat Lab to bring those things together and become kind of the regional sort of heat authority or heat resource group, where people can come and say, I would like to plant 60,000 trees, for example. Where are the communities that would most benefit from trees? Or, what pedestrian routes can we identify in different neighborhoods so that we can implement shade structures, or whatever we identify as some of the steps to move forward. We can be that group that helps those interventions be the most effective and provide the most value for our communities. I'm also thinking about doing some focus groups over the summer with as many different populations as I can get set up. But I'm not certain focus groups are necessarily the most effective way to engage. So when I get to my discussion questions, I would love to hear about any other projects that you all have been involved with that utilized focus groups, maybe what went well, what didn't, maybe, throw some other ideas at me for this. And our challenges. Of course, we have challenges. So as I mentioned before, there is this existing body of kind of knowledge and actions that have been identified by various entities here in Southern Nevada. I'm most familiar with Clark County since I worked there, and they've identified things like creating community resilience hubs to help folks cope with heat. Other entities like the city of Las Vegas have set a goal for tree plantings. So there are some things that have already been decided that will be worked on going forward that I don't know if calling them path dependencies is the right thing, but that these are actions that we can either, we could support or we can inform, but those are things that are going to happen. And I spoke a little bit about that lack of heat ownership. So as attitudes towards heat have started to change in Las Vegas, different community groups, Clark County, City of Las Vegas, City of Henderson, City of North Las Vegas, have all sort of identified pieces and parts of what they think they can do to help our community cope with our extreme temperatures. But that doesn't mean that they can kind of wrap their hands around the complexities of this issue. I mentioned it's a very systemic issue here. Everybody here is exposed to extreme heat, but the experience of that extreme heat is very dependent on other sorts of factors, like what part of the city you live in. Can you afford to run your air conditioning? Are you housed? So tackling something that touches every aspect of our life here in Southern Nevada is exceptionally challenging. And so it's very difficult for any one of these entities to say, okay, we're the heat folks. And that's kind of where the Southern Nevada Heat Resilience Lab came from, is that we would like to build that community of practice and be that resource and help pull all these different threads together so that there is an entity that owns heat and can kind of cope with that complexity and work within that complexity to help adapt our metro area to increasingly hotter summers. As mentioned before, we have we have reports, we have studies, but what wasn't done sort of prior to the heat lab was really good community engagement. So there were some surveys that went out, stakeholders were brought to the table, but it was kind of a sliver of all the people that I think need to have a voice in what heat adaptation looks like. And I think one of the biggest questions that remains unanswered that I think about so much in this work is that we've never asked our frontline communities what they feel they need. And I think that that's an extremely important conversation to have, and it stands to be exceptionally informative and possibly even surprising what folks might bring to the table. Sometimes, I talk about trees a lot because there's a lot of focus on expanding tree canopy right now, but that does come with a lot of challenges. And I often wonder, are trees the only right solution? If we engaged with community, maybe we would hear they want more splash pads or a pool, or it could be really anything, but that's a big black, just a big oversight in how some of the actions around heat and conversation around heat adaptation has been framed previously. There's also a big sense of urgency when it comes to this work. It's almost June somehow. I don't really know how that happened, which means that we're getting into that heat season. And although we've had a cooler and wetter than average spring, that doesn't mean that we're going to have a mild summer. And what does a mild summer really even mean when, we have days that are regularly over 100 degrees? And we also know that we have neighborhoods that are on average 11 degrees hotter, if not more, than other neighborhoods in our metro area. So there is a sense of urgency of needing to take that action, of needing to start these conversations as soon as possible. But then, that's held in tension with issues of capacity. I am one person. I also spend 50% of my time on the rest of the CNAP projects. And also the capacity of collaborators to take urgent action. And even if urgent action is the best course. So there's a lot of, at least in my mind, that leaves our project with it kind of in an uncertain space. How do you begin a program? How do you begin a project when you know that urgent action is necessary, but sometimes you have to go slow to go fast. So there's tension there as well for me and for my collaborators. And the project also needs a fair amount of academic rigor and kind of research structure built into it, because our hope is that by asking these questions and developing frameworks and undertaking this engagement in this kind of environment that combines urgency and uncertainty, that we can come out with something that is not only publishable, and I personally don't really care much about publishing, but other people do, but also can serve as a resource, as an example, as a learning opportunity for other types of projects in this space, and not necessarily just heat-related projects, although I think people would find value in that, certainly if they're working on the same issue. But to keep looking at models of engagement And sorry, I just got a distracting pop-up. Models of engagement and co-creation, co-production with community. And also kind of, what does that co-production look like, at least in this region? What might it look like for other regions? We've also had some changes in state leadership. Prior to our current governor, our Governor Sisolak had kind of a state office on heat and heat resilience and kind of all the different issues that come with it, which was not renewed under the new leadership. So the priority of working on these issues is changing a little bit. It's still very, very important on a local level, but we see a little less involvement from higher up, which is not necessarily surprising or discouraging, but it still impacts us. And also, this is new. The Southern Nevada Heat Resilience Lab is very, very new, which is a challenge in and of itself. I didn't pick up the reins of something that already had, structure and collaborators and certain funding streams. And we're new to the community as well. Not a whole lot of people know about us yet. So that's a challenge as well. How do we become a resource? How do we strategize around that? How do we build structure around it? How do I take something that is in kind of that seed stage and get it to a point where it's flourishing? And then this is not lasting nearly as long as I thought it would, but that's okay. I think I'm talking a little fast. So some of our needs, the needs for this project are opportunities to engage and build trust throughout the community. That can be incredibly challenging. So I've looked at different types of community-based organizations, and although these community-based organizations don't necessarily identify themselves as working in the climate adaptation space, they are still functioning that way within the community. So identifying those organizations who are out there, who may be helping people to afford, running their air conditioning, or helping folks find food resources. I recently saw a report on food insecurity in Southern Nevada, and a full 20% of the respondents that were surveyed for this report said that they often choose between cooling their homes and putting food on the table. So I suspect that there are quite a few community-based organizations that weren't necessarily looped in as heat work began here in Southern Nevada, because they weren't necessarily identified as being a part of that space, but certainly absolutely are. And I feel that in my role with the Southern Nevada Heat Resilience Lab, I need to establish communication. I need to show up to their rooms and to their events before I start asking people to come and participate with us. And I think that that's a really exciting opportunity for me as a person, and to get to know my community better, and to help identify other needs around climate adaptation and heat adaptation. I touched a little bit on the second bullet point, which is partners in collaboration. So both community partners and local government. And again, I think we get into the capacity issue here as well. Most of our local government folks are very enthusiastic about working further on heat, but have limited opportunities to collaborate and to come to the table and to pick up pieces of this work beyond what they've already identified. And certainly, community organizations have some of the same challenges. And then two, we get back to that structure, informal versus formal. Does one need to come before the other? What benefits are there to keeping this kind of informal versus, we're going to have, a formal meeting, every other month during the summer, and then a couple times over a cool summer or over a cool season? That's all structure that we're still trying to determine. And again, too, data collection and methodology. What is going to work? what can we replicate? What is going to get us the best information so that we provide value to our community and to our decision makers. And so this is the part where I hope you guys chime in and talk to me a little bit about what you have done, what your thoughts are. If you've ever been in charge of a new project and grown it into something that has kind of taken on its own life, and I'm very eager to hear about that. So CNAP, which is a CAP-RISA program, is trying to make space for transformational change. And I certainly see the opportunities for the Heat Lab to, make transformational change. But one of the questions I have are, what are the conditions that are necessary for transformational change? How do you make space for something as challenging as transformational change? And how do you know when you're making good space for that? How do you know you have the right structure? Is it even about structure? I don't know. Transformational change is a very big and snarly thing. The other thing is on scope of collaboration. So I'm still, the Heat Lab is still working towards quality, meaningful listening and engagement with community. But we're also a part of a larger network of practitioners and metro areas that are working on heat resilience. Phoenix has an entire office dedicated to heat. So does Los Angeles. There's a heat lab over at UCLA. So what scope of collaboration is best for something that is new? And is there kind of diminishing returns on always finding more collaborators and participating more and more? I suspect that there might not be at all, ever. But I'd also like to hear a little bit about that from the folks here on the call. And then also, how to build up this program. That's a big open question. Like, we have a strategy-ish for year one. We have kind of a perspective on years 2 and 3. But if, I would love feedback on how programs and projects related to resilience and adaptation have evolved in your own work or from what you know. And then 2, support versus leadership here in the Southern Nevada region, and sort of navigating between the two. So I feel that there are spaces in which we will be a supporter, lending data, knowledge, whatever. And then there are other spaces in which we will need to take a leadership role to keep this work moving forward. I'm interested to hear about that from your own work as well.
Ariel,
yes.
How about this? I would love for us to spend a lot more time on your discussion questions.
Yeah.
Maybe at one of our future summer meetings in July or in the early fall. I'm hoping that we could maybe circle back, and you might be willing to help lead that discussion so we could put these out to the members of this group to think about a little bit.
Sure, absolutely. Did I already bump up against the time limit?
You're fine.
Okay.
We want to make sure we have time for this focus group with Mia Dozier, who asked us for some time at our meeting for some focus groups. And she's ASAP's training specialist, and they're looking at something that fits right with the topic. So you've led us into these focus groups just beautifully. They're looking at the value of climate adaptation, and how do you maybe focus this on national service programs for rural communities, which is one of those stakeholder groups that you were interested in thinking about. And we could think about, we'll take your discussion questions and put them ahead, but we want to turn the meeting over to Mia so that they can break us into some discussion groups where we can tackle some of these from a little bit different standpoint. But really, let's give Ariel a virtual hand. Thank you so much for talking about your research institute. That was wonderful information, and I'm so happy that there's a really group of smart researchers helping us with these issues in the southwestern part of our country.
Yes. Thank you so
Mia,
much for the opportunity.
thank you so much, Ariel. We'll look forward to catching back up on this topic at a future meeting, and we'll be coordinating with you on that. And Mia, thank you so much for being with us to help lead these focus groups.